Hello YouTube and welcome back to Be a Loser. In a previous video we discussed how insulin and cortisol cause obesity. Insulin is the main driver of obesity and the body set weight. If we increase insulin levels, then we gain weight. So the next obvious question is, what foods cause increased insulin? And since we're eating LCHF, then we assume that it's carbohydrates, most notably highly refined sugars and grains. But does this mean that all carbohydrates cause obesity? Well, that's the premise of the Carbohydrate-Insulin Hypothesis and was the basis of some very famous diets, most notably the Atkins diet. So, is this hypothesis correct? Well, let's find out by putting a microscope on carbohydrates and the LCHF diet. To backtrack a bit, we discussed in our weight gain series that there were cultures that ate diets high in carbohydrates and still suffered no diabetes plus obesity. So this would indicate that the CIH is incorrect or incomplete. Currently, East Asians eat a diet very high in white rice, which is a refined carbohydrate. They eat significantly more of it than North Americans. So we would assume that because their diet is so high in refined carbs, that they must suffer from high levels of obesity. Yet, that is not the case. Obesity rates only began to rise in the early 2000s when their diet became more westernized. Now, because so many diets around the world are becoming westernized, it's a good idea to review the history of diets in different regions of the world. A study was done that compared the diets of 4 different countries during the late 1990s, meaning what these countries ate at that time. Those countries were the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and China. And as we've already stated, the total carb intake of China was far higher than the other nations. So the CIH would tell us that they would have the highest obesity. But that was not true. So obviously, a closer look is required. As it turns out, the sugar intake in China was very low compared to the others. So this implies that sugar is far more fattening or obesogenic than other carbs. Japan had lower sugar intake than the US and UK and little obesity until recently as well. So if we look even closer, we see that the majority of refined carbs eaten in the East is rice, while in the West, it tends to be refined wheat and corn. So the implication of this is that rice is less obesogenic than wheat. And a book titled Wheat Belly offers some further possibilities. As we know, fruits that we eat today are very different than those that were eaten by our ancestors. They've been cross-pollinated to become far sweeter. Well, the New York Times best-selling book postulates that the same is true of wheat. The wheat we eat today is far different than that eaten by our ancestors. And it's true that almost all wheat that's commercially grown is of the dwarf or semi-dwarf variety, and the long-term impact of these changes is unknown. So, back to the carbohydrate-insulin hypothesis. What we can gather so far is that while this hypothesis is not totally wrong, well, it's not totally right either. And as we've stated before, there are primitive cultures that ate carbohydrates as the majority of their diets. The Kitavans of Papua New Guinea were studied by Stefan Lindberg. He determined that they ate diets very high in unrefined carbohydrate and had low blood insulin levels and almost no obesity. So, obviously, low blood insulin levels equates to low obesity rates, and high carbohydrate intake does not necessarily indicate high blood insulin levels. The Okinawans of Japan were another such example. Their diet was very high in sweet potatoes, which is another form of unrefined carb. And yet, not only did they have virtually non-existent obesity rates, but they also lived longer than almost any other society. The issue is that the CIH is based on the sum of medical knowledge up to about 1850 with William Banting. Remember old Billy? Yeah. Well, and so instead of correcting the flaws in the hypothesis with modern medical knowledge, most people just abandoned it altogether. We know that the insulin-obesity link is sound. Giving insulin increases weight gain. But the carbohydrate-insulin link is incomplete. This is why there's still great controversy surrounding whether or not carbohydrates are actually good. I mean, some people swear by eating fruits and others stand firm on eating none. But the truth, as it often does, lies somewhere in the middle. There are good carbs, such as whole fruits and vegetables. And there are bad carbs, such as refined sugar and flour. I think everyone would agree that eating a lot of broccoli won't make you fat. But eating a lot of ice cream will make you fat. So, how do these two things differ? We need to find a way to separate the good from the bad. So, let's start by defining exactly what a carbohydrate is, shall we? Carbohydrates are chains of sugars that are linked together. Originally, they were classified as simple and complex carbohydrates. The simple ones consisted of 1 to 2 sugars linked together. These included glucose and sucrose. Now, sucrose is glucose and fructose combined. Now, complex carbs were longer chains of sugars, such as flour. The problem here is that this only separates the carbohydrates based on chain length, but not on their effect in the body. For example, white flour, a complex carb, has the same effect in the body as the simple carb, glucose. So in 1981, Dr. David Jenkins measured the effect each food has on blood glucose and then listed them based on that effect. This is known as the glycemic index. In this index, glucose is set as the standard at 100, and other foods are measured against that. The issue with this system is that not all foods contain the same amount of carbohydrate. So there are distortions based on the amounts of each food ingested. So to correct this, the glycemic load, or GL, was created. This system accounts for the percentage of carbohydrate in each food. There are many diets based on the GI or GL systems, but they both have major problems. Blood glucose does not drive weight gain. We already know that hormones do, and mainly insulin. So our diet should be tailored to lower insulin levels, not glucose levels. Most people assume that this is the same thing, but the insulin index of foods is actually very different than the glycemic index. Furthermore, the GI and GL do not account for foods other than carbohydrates. Protein also tends to increase insulin, so eating a high-protein diet may also result in weight gain, but we'll cover that in another video. However, the GI is still useful. Processed, refined foods tend to have a very high GI value, while natural whole foods tend to have a low GI value. And as we know, most carbs of the Western Hemisphere are refined. So what is it about the processing that makes carbs more fattening? Well, one reason is that refining might possibly lead to overconsumption. I mean, let's assume a glass of orange juice is the juice of 5 oranges. Well, it's a heck of a lot easier to drink a glass of orange juice than to eat 5 oranges. I mean, I'm not sure if I could sit down and eat that many oranges if I tried. The other reason refining is dangerous is that absorption is increased. This leads to a much higher spike in glucose and insulin levels. This is true of refined grains as well and leads to overconsumption. Eating whole grain is far more difficult. Now, there's a part of digestible food that is a carbohydrate that our body cannot break down for absorption. This part is known as fiber. Fiber is obviously important to the LCHF diet, as it's specifically mentioned when discussing carbohydrates. But why exactly is it important? Well, fiber has several suggested benefits, such as bulking, viscosity, and fermentation. It's believed that the increased bulk of fiber might fill the stomach more and lead to eating less. It may also slow how quickly our stomachs empty. Additionally, the fiber increases the bulk of stool in the colon, thus decreasing the time it takes to get out of the body. Let's not dwell on that image, but it was hypothesized, meaning guessed, that this would aid in reducing colon cancer. Now, there are two types of fiber, soluble and insoluble, which is based on whether or not the fiber can dissolve in water. Soluble fiber can often increase the viscosity or thickness of the gut and possibly change how other nutrients are absorbed. The fiber contained in some plants has phytic acid, which might reduce the absorption of sugars as a possible benefit. Now, this increased gut viscosity can slow food movement and interfere with digestion in such a way to have a positive effect of satiety, or a feeling of fullness. Also, the fermentation aspect of fiber may feed the good bacteria in our guts, which would be beneficial. All of these were just assumptions based on the different aspects of fiber. Fiber was originally brought into the mainstream in the 1970s when native cultures began experiencing diseases of civilization after their diets became westernized. These diseases, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, were previously very rare in these cultures. Some doctors at the time believed that it was refined carbohydrates, predominantly sugar and white flour, that were the culprits. Unfortunately, these refined carbs had the benefit of being stored without spoiling, which was naturally quite advantageous. As we know from a previous video, much debate raged between carbs and fat as the driver of these diseases of civilization. And unfortunately, we know the outcome of that. So because of this, the CIH went the way of the dodo, extinct. So Dennis Burkitt and others began reforming the CIH to become the dietary fiber hypothesis. This seemed logical as traditional unrefined carbohydrates were typically very high in fiber. So if unrefined carbs didn't cause these diseases, then fiber must be good for you. Unfortunately, they didn't know how it was good for you. So huge studies were undertaken to determine just that. One such study included 88,000 women to identify if increased fiber intake would reduce the risk of colorectal cancer. After a 16-year follow-up period, it was shown that this simply was not the case. More fiber did not decrease incidence of this cancer. Another trial endeavored to show the benefits of fiber on adenoma, a type of precancerous lesion. 1,300 subjects were randomized for high fiber or normal fiber ingestion, and the result was, well, nothing. Fiber intake alone did not reduce the risk of these cancerous lesions. And in a more recent trial, those subjects that received fiber supplements did not apparently benefit. And in fact, it may have increased their risk of dying. So where the hell is the benefit in that? This is why using fiber as a means of weight loss has all but disappeared. The main problem with fiber is that when we think of food, we think of the nutrients that it contains, vitamins, minerals, and such. But fiber is not beneficial as a nutrient, meaning it's not good because of what it adds to your body. Quite the contrary. Fiber is good because of what it removes from your body. In this sense, fiber is an anti-nutrient, which sounds bad, but is actually good. To demonstrate this, let's review another study in which 13 type 2 diabetic patients were given an identical meal consisting of 55% carbohydrate. The only difference was that one group had fiber added to the meal. And the result was that in the fiber group, insulin and glucose spikes were reduced. Because insulin is the main driver of obesity and T2D, anything that reduces insulin is beneficial. So if we think of glucose as metabolic poison, then fiber is the antidote. And this is wonderful because almost all plant foods in their natural and unrefined state contain fiber. Nature, in her glory, has packaged the antidote along with the poison. So the problem arises when the natural plant food is processed and refined, like sugar and white flour. This processing removes the fiber, the antidote. And now we're eating the poison without the antidote. So this clearly illustrates the connection between fiber intake and type 2 diabetes. So a pair of studies looked at the risk of T2D based on glycemic index diets and the cereal fiber intake. If you eat a high glycemic index diet but have high intake of fiber, then T2D risk is not increased, meaning that you are ingesting high amounts of the poison but also high amounts of the antidote. And similarly, if you eat a low glycemic index diet with low amounts of fiber, your risk is also not increased. Less poison and less antidote equals no risk. But if you eat a high GI diet with low fiber, then your risk of T2D increases by a whopping 75%. Lots of poison with little antidote is obviously a deadly combo. Processing cereal grains removes the fiber and fat, which increases its glycemic index. And further refining it has the added detriment of allowing it to be very easily absorbed by your body. Easy to absorb poison, just what the doctor ordered. This result of a high GI diet with low fiber being extremely dangerous has been proven again and again by numerous studies. One such study shows the risk to have increased by 272%. They're all linked in the description if you wish to read them. It should also be noted that the benefits of ingesting the antidote, the fiber, are best gained during or just before your meal. Taking the fiber long before eating has far less benefit. Now, all carbohydrates, with the exception of honey, contain fiber in their natural state. Processing them is what makes them toxic. In fact, processing any food will make it toxic, be it fat or protein. But that will be covered in another video. What's important to remember for carbohydrates is that the toxicity does not lie in the food itself, but instead in the processing of that food. This is why we eat whole foods on LCHF and why fast food, which is almost all processed, is so very, very bad for us. And that's it for this video. As we continue in this series, we'll cover many more aspects of the LCHF diet, including sugar, fat, protein, fruit, and much more. So be sure to subscribe to the channel to get the videos. And remember to enable alerts by clicking the bell so you're updated when we upload new videos. The bell should be grayed out if alerts are enabled. If it's white, then they're not enabled. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Be a Loser Today, as we post updates there as well. And of course, if you like the videos, please remember to click the like button, as it does help get the channel more exposure. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, keep being a loser.